A large part of the lament tradition within the Old Testament is that of the Lament Psalms, which are found within the book of Psalms, which is also referred to as the Psalter. Now, the genre of Lament Psalms is comprised of about 60 psalms. The exact number of psalms classified as Lament Psalms does vary slightly depending on the author that you read. But regardless, the genre of Lament Psalms is the largest single group of psalms in the book of Psalms. At roughly 60 psalms, it comprises about 40% of the total number of the psalms. And thus, the lament tradition in the Psalter is not a minor element, but rather a very significant key component in the book of Psalms. Now, there are two kinds of lament psalms as defined by who the speakers are. There are individual lament psalms in which the speaker is an individual person, and such is evidenced through the grammatical singular of I and me. The individual lament psalms, thus, are the first person prayers that are voiced to God in the distress that the individual person is experiencing. And thus they reflect the personal faith of the prayers as they express their petitions for help to God. An example of an individual lament psalm is Psalm 6. Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I fled my bed with weeping and drenched my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all of my foes. Away from me, all you who do evil. For the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overthrown with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame. So there are individual lament psalms, but the second kind of psalms is that of community or communal lament psalms, in which the speakers are the collective community, and thus the first person plural, we and us, is used. An example of a community lament psalm is that of Psalm 44. But now you have rejected and humbled us. You no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemy, and our adversaries have plundered us. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. You have made us a reproach to our neighbors, the scorn and derision of those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations. The people shake their heads at us. All this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. Our hearts have not turned back. Our feet have not strayed from your path. But you crushed us and made us a haunt of jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. Yet for your sake, we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us. Rescue us because of your unfailing love. So the two kinds of lament psalms illustrate the prayers when in the midst of the disorienting circumstances that both the individual and the corporate community express their words to God. And laments are thus voiced by both individuals in the struggle with the personal issues of distress and trauma and catastrophe. But they are also used by the corporate community when the collective entity is facing tragedy. A majority of the community laments psalms reflect military situations where the nation has been or was being attacked by foreign enemies. And that seems to be the circumstance reflected there in Psalm 44. But other community lament psalms arise out of societal moral injustices that are occurring. So contemporary examples of when a lament could be used appropriately by the community are such as the coronavirus pandemic, which has affected local communities, in fact, whole nations, and even the world. Or a community lament would be appropriate in crying out to God over the actions of racial injustice that have occurred within our society. So we have both individual lament psalms and community or communal lament psalms. Let me make a brief side note about the authorship of the lament psalms, and this is applicable to the psalms as a whole. Whether some of these individual lament psalms were written by David and thus reflect specific incidences in David's life, that factor of the Davidic authorship is viewed secondary to this discussion when it comes to the contemporary application and use of the lament psalms. The incorporation of these psalms into the prayer book and song book of the Old Testament congregation, that is, the collection of the Book of Psalms, its incorporation there means that their function is not for the purpose of historical recitation or merely recalling or remembering David's experience, but rather the collected psalms are to be appropriated by the worshiping community, both individually and corporately, as model prayers to be prayed and sung by the community and individuals when worshiping. And thus they are intended to be reused in situations that are quite diverse from those that David experienced and the experiences which elicited the writing of the Psalms. It's just like songs we sing in corporate worship, that the historical setting and the specifics of the individual's experience out of which the authors wrote them, it becomes irrelevant to our use of them in making them our words as we sing them. In the congregational singing in worship, we do not need to know who the author of the lyrics was, or we do not need to know who the composer of the music was, nor do we need to know the specifics of the situation that evoked the song that we are singing. For example, to sing Amazing Grace, one does not need to know anything about John Newton or the circumstances of his personal life in the late 1700s. In our use of the worship songs, even though the words were written by somebody else, we sing them as our words. And thus the function of the songs as collected within the Book of Psalms is that the lament psalms are to be appropriated by us in a wide variety of circumstances of being disoriented. And the words of the psalm are to be used by any subsequent worshiper as their expressions to God of their concerns and sentiments. Now, in defining the literary genre of lament, it is done primarily so through that of life context and form. With respect to the life context, we spoke about it in the previous lecture of the Psalms and the life rhythm cycle. That within the life rhythm cycle, the Lament Psalms fit into the category of being disoriented. As mentioned, reflected in the Psalms are actually two ways of moving through disorientation, that of the Psalms of trust and confidence. Those Psalms which voice spiritual affirmation, they express confidence and trust in God in spite of the distressing circumstances or the attacks that are occurring. In other words, the attitude of life is the pits, but I will trust and praise God anyway. But the other way of moving through disorientation is that of spiritual questioning. Life is the pits. Why, O Lord? And that mode of dealing with disorientation is what is reflected in the Lament Psalms. And so when we are in the season of being disoriented or in a time of spiritual questioning, we can appropriate the words of the Lament Psalms as fitting prayers for us to be voicing to God. So with respect to life setting, the Lament Psalms fit into the life rhythm cycle, the season of disorientation. And that is partly the way in which we define the literary genre of lament. But the second way of identifying the genre of Lament Psalms is based on its literary features or characteristics, that is, its form. And with respect to form, a key defining characteristic of Lament Psalms is that they are prayers addressed to God. Now, such is evident through the grammar that God is being spoken to directly. One of the grammatical indicators is that of the vocative. Now, the vocative is when directly addressing somebody, we say their name. For example, John, please do this. Now, oftentimes in English translations of the Bible, the vocative is translated by O, followed by the name of the one being addressed. So in this case, O Lord or O God. But more modern English translations just use the name without the O. That is actually the normal way that we speak. We don't say, "Oh, John, please do this." No, we just say the name followed by the request. And so, for example, the New International Version, which is the one that I am using in this study, it just uses the divine name without any prefaced O. But the point is that in the Lament Psalms, it is obvious that God is being directly addressed through the use of the vocative. But another grammatical indicator of direct address is that God is spoken to in the second person singular, you. And a third grammatical indicator is that the petitions to God are mostly in the grammatical imperative, which is the verbal form of direct request. So if we go back to our example of Psalm 6, we see in verses 1 through 4 how this psalm is clearly directly addressed to God. It begins with a vocative, Lord, and then moves to the second person singular. Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. And the requests or the petitions are expressed in the imperative. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long? Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? So we can clearly see that the Lament Psalms are prayers directed to God, which means that they are not merely the psalmist's journaling of their thoughts or composing a song with no specific audience in mind. And the lament psalms are not merely the psalmist mulling over their situation in their mind, such that the psalmist becomes the audience, thus he's kind of speaking to himself in his mind about the situation. Nor the lament psalms the psalmist complaining to other people about the situation. No, they are prayers directed toward God, which means that the primary purpose of the lament psalms is not merely for the psalmist to cathartically voice and vent their feelings, nor is it merely to bring clarity to the psalmist about the situation. Now, although the psalms may do that for the psalmist, but if catharsis and clarity were the primary purposes, again, there would be no need for an external audience. Rather, the primary purpose of the lament psalms, and thus the direct address to God, is to present the situation to God and solicit God's help. So, as prayers to God, the laments presume a dialogue type relationship with God, in which God is directly spoken to in the petitions and the complaint. And even though in the communication event of the psalm itself, rarely is there a verbal response by God, nevertheless, the address to God presumes that God is a partner in the dialogue, and that he does hear what the psalmist is saying, and that God will answer through his actions on behalf of the psalmist. So a key identifying literary form element of the lament psalms is that they are directly addressed to God. But within the lament psalms, there are also three recurring literary components. And these three key recurring components are those of complaint, petition, and that of declaration of confidence and trust. Now, these three components are not equally proportionate to each other in the particular psalms. In other words, some lament psalms might have more complaint than petition, while another lament psalm might have a very high proportion of petition, but not much complaint. Nevertheless, all three components are almost always present in each particular lament psalm. And another thing about these three components, they need not occur in any particular sequence. In fact, in most lament psalms, they alternate back and forth and are very much intertwined with each other. So the first key component is that of complaint. Complaint consists of the outcry of the psalmist due to the psalmist's agony and suffering. So in one sense, complaint is more like a description of the disorientation that the psalmist is experiencing. But it's not a detached description. Rather, it is a very emotionally engaged description. So the complaints can consist of the emotionally laden description of the external circumstances of disorientation that are occurring to the psalmist, as well as the internal, emotional, psychological, and spiritual toll that the circumstances are taking on the psalmist. And thus the complaint consists of expressions of grief, of pain, of dissatisfaction with the situation. And thus the complaints also voice the spiritual questions about why God is allowing or causing the distress to happen. Now we need to note that in the lament complaint, we need to distinguish that component from generic complaining. Now, our use of the verb complaining often carries more negative connotations, that of griping or whining about something. But with respect to the complaint as a form component of the lament genre, it needs to be understood more as a technical literary term without it necessarily carrying any of the more negative connotations of complaining. And thus we need to distinguish the complaint component in the Lament Psalms from the grumbling and complaining, murmuring type of complaining that the Israelites did in the wilderness in Exodus and Numbers. The focus of the wilderness grumbling and murmuring was the people's desire to no longer follow God's leading, came out of a lack of their trust in God being able to provide deliverance and physical sustenance for them. And its intent was to retreat back to the previous condition of slavery. In other words, they wanted to go back to Egypt rather than to move forward toward the promised land. In contrast, the complaint in the Lament Psalms is voiced alongside of declarations of confidence and trust in God, and thus reaffirms God's sovereignty over the situation. And its focus is to move forward to deliverance so as to get out of the disorienting circumstance. And a key formal distinction between the two is that the lament is spoken directly to God, as we just said, while the murmuring and grumbling in Exodus and Numbers was the people talking about God. They did not speak directly to God in their prayer and supplication. And thus the differences mean that the complaint as found in the Lament Psalms is considered to be appropriate in the dialogue relationship with God. In fact, as we just said, complaint is a key component in the prayer dialogue with God, whereas the grumbling and murmuring is considered as an inappropriate attitude of rebellion against God. Now, in the Lament Psalms, the circumstances of disorientation usually involve three participants. The enemies, or most often human enemies, but on occasion they do seem to be other destructive forces such as disease. A second participant is that of the psalmist or the lamenter. And a third participant is obviously God, who is being addressed. So the expressions of complaint can focus on any one of those three participants. And again, oftentimes the three kinds of complaint are interwoven with one another and juxtaposed to one another, that the psalm shifts back and forth from one kind of complaint to the other. But sometimes the complaint focuses on what they, the enemies, are doing to the psalmist. And this takes primarily the form of description or accusation against the enemies. So what is emphasized, one of the things is that the psalmists are threatening or attacking. The enemies are conspiring against the psalmist. They're surrounding, trying to attack the psalmist. They are attempting to take the psalmist's life. But not only are the enemies threatening and attacking actions emphasized, also emphasized are the hostile words of the enemies. They mock, they scorn, they taunt, they revel in the psalmist's misfortune. We can see this in Psalm 38 in the they complaint in verses 11 and 12 and 19 and 20. My friends and companions avoid me because of my wounds. My neighbors stay far away. Those who want to kill me set their traps. Those who would harm me talk of my ruin. All day long they scheme and they lie. Many have become my enemies without cause. Those who hate me without reason are numerous. Those who repay my good with evil lodge accusations against me, though I seek only to do what is good. And in the Lament Psalms, the enemies are classified as wicked, as those who plot evil, those who do not obey God's word, those who view themselves beyond God's judgment. And so, because of the nature of the enemies, the they complaint is usually used more like it would be used in a legal setting, of filing a formal complaint against someone for wrongdoing. The enemies are thus being legally accused of wrongdoing, with that complaint needing to be adjudicated by God. Sometimes the complaint focuses on how the psalmist is feeling or on the effects of the distress on the psalmist. And these are called I complaints as the psalmists speak about themselves, and they are very descriptive of both their external physical suffering as well as their internal psychological and emotional suffering. So they frequently mention their grief, their sorrow, their anguish, their shame, their being alone and abandoned, and their continual weeping. Again, illustrating this, the I complaint from Psalm 38 in verses 6 through 8 and 10, and then 13, 14, and 17. The psalmist describes their situation. I am bowed down and brought very low. All day long I go about mourning. My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. My heart pounds, my strength fails me. Even the light has gone from my eyes. I am like the deaf who cannot hear, like the mute who cannot speak. I have become like one who does not hear, whose mouth can offer no reply. For I am about to fall, and my pain is ever with me. But sometimes the psalmists turn their attention of complaint on God, and these are referred to as you complaints, since they are being directly addressed to God. And you complaints tend to focus on two things. One is that of God's lack of attention, his seeming remoteness, the sense that God has abandoned them, that God is hiding his face from them, that God has forgotten them. Or conversely, they attribute to God the circumstances of the distress. It's not that God is not paying attention, rather, he's doing too many negative things toward them, that it is God who has brought the circumstances upon the psalmist. Now, sometimes the you complaint is in the form of a question to God. And the question is thus a manner of indirectly expressing the complaint. Questions of how long or why. So examples of these you complaints in the form of a question, for example, Psalm 10, why, Lord, do you stand off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Or Psalm 13, how long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Or Psalm 44, why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? But sometimes the you complaints are declarative statements about how the psalmists feel God is treating them. For example, Psalm 44, which is again a communal lament. But you have rejected and humbled us. You no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemies, and you gave us up to be devoured like sheep, and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. You have made us a reproach to our enemies, the scorn and derision of those around us. You have made us a byword among the nations. But you crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. Now, as declarative statements directed toward God, the you complaints can take on more the connotation of criticism or the lodging of a protest, as they imply that this is not the way that God should be acting. But again, we need to keep in mind that such criticism is voiced to God himself. Now, the function of the complaints, whether they are they complaints, I complaints, or you complaints, the function is really to fully lay out before the Lord the situation from which the psalmist is seeking deliverance. So in a sense, the psalmist is saying, God, look how bad things are. Please act. That the purpose of the complaints is not just to be descriptive of the situation. Rather, the complaints do function as motivations for God to act. And then the complaint is thus tied and leads to the second key component, that of petition. Now, petitions are the psalmist's expressions of what they would like God to do in direct response to the specific complaints. The petitions to God are addressed to God, and frequently, thus, they are in the grammatical imperative. And as the psalmist petitions, they frequently also incorporate the reasons or the motivating factors as to why God should respond. And there are two kinds of petitions that are highlighted in the Lament Psalms. One is that of calls for God's attention. The petitions request God to direct his attention toward the psalmist and toward their situation. They implore God to take notice, to give ear to heed their cry. An example of this kind of petition is found in some of those of Psalm 143. Lord, hear my prayer. Listen to my cry for mercy. Again, with motivation. In your faithfulness and righteousness, come to my relief. Answer me quickly, Lord. My soul fails. Do not hide your face from me, or I will be like those who go down to the pit. Let the morning bring me word of your unfailing love. That the call to attention petitions are expressed because to the psalmist, it seems like God is not paying attention or not seeing what is happening. And it seems like God is inactive when he should be doing something about the situation. And thus God's attention needs to be aroused so that he will act. But a second kind of prominent petition is that of imploring God to protect or to deliver. And thus the psalmist requests for God to oppose and defeat the enemies. And from the psalmist's viewpoint, God's destruction of the enemies is thus the only way in which the deliverance will occur. Again, illustrating this from Psalm 143, the psalmist gives the petition, rescue me from my enemies, Lord, with motivation, for I hide myself in you. For your name's sake, Lord, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring me out of trouble. In your unfailing love, silence my enemies, destroy all my foes, for I am your servant. A third key component in the Lament Psalms are those of declarations of trust and confidence in God. That throughout the Lament Psalms, the psalmists repeatedly voice their commitment and loyalty to God based on a covenant trust relationship. Now, sometimes the declarations of confidence and trust are straightforward. The psalmists affirm that God is their personal God. They affirm that God is their refuge and the one who is their deliverer, in whom they are trusting and turning to. For example, straightforward declarations. I put my confidence in you. I trust in you, O God. Or I put my hope in you, O God. Another way the psalmists frequently speak of their confidence in God is through the use of metaphors, of God being spoken of as their shield, their rock, their refuge, their fortress, their stronghold. Sometimes the confidence is expressed through the psalmist affirming God's reciprocal relationship with the psalmist. And thus the declarations of trust and confidence will rehearse or recite the characteristics of God. They speak of his steadfast love. They speak of his faithfulness, his goodness, his righteousness, his mercy and grace. And it is those divine characteristics that are eliciting this sense of confidence and trust in God. But a fourth form is that the declaration of confidence also include the assurance, statements of assurance that God has heard their prayer and that God will assuredly deliver. To illustrate these forms in verses 1 through 8 is the confidence section at the beginning of Psalm 31. And you can see how the statements of confidence and trust are intertwined with the petitions. But in verse 1, statement of confidence, in you, Lord, I have taken refuge. And the use of the metaphor, since you are my rock and my fortress in verse 3 and verse 4. For you are my refuge. But statements of confidence and trust as straightforward declarations and noting a characteristic of God in verse 5, into my hands I commit my spirit. Or in verse 6, as for me, I trust in the Lord. And then reciting the characteristic of God, his faithfulness. Into my hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. And statements of assurance that God has heard and delivered are found there in verses 7 and 8. I will be glad and rejoice in your love. For you saw my affliction and knew the anguish of my soul. You have not given me into the hands of the enemy, and have set my feet in a spacious place. Now, the Psalms of confidence and trust function in several ways. One of them is that they do highlight the psalmist's relationship with God, and that relationship forms the basis for the lamenter praying. The laments arise out of that pre-existing covenant relationship of trust. And this also means that the other components of the lament psalms, in other words, the complaints and the petitions, must be interpreted in light of and read as part of that trust relationship. But a second function is the declarations of trust are part of the theological foundation for the petitions. It is the psalmist trust relationship that forms part of the motivation for God to act on behalf of the psalmist. For example, there in Psalm 31, which we read some of these, you can see the intertwining of the petitions with the declarations of trust. And it becomes obvious that the declarations of trust form the motivating reasons that God should respond as petitions. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Verse 3, since you are my rock and my fortress, for the sake of your name, lead and guide me. Keep me from the trap that is set for me. Why? For you are my refuge. That, again, God's delivering is based on that covenant trust relationship that exists between the psalmist and God. And a third function of these declarations of confidence and trust is that they help the psalmist maintain a proper perspective of the situations. That the declarations of trust in God counterbalance the despair of the situation as expressed in the complaint. That psychologically and spiritually, the psalmist's trust is bolstered or strengthened or reinforced as they reaffirm their relationship with God, as they remind themselves of who God is and what God means personally to them. That by merely putting into words their trust in God, it enhances their own sense of the trust that they do have. And it heightens the sense of assurance that God will hear. So within the Lament Psalms, there are three recurring elements that comprise the Lament Psalms, that of complaint, petition, confidence, and trust. And without those three elements, you do not have a lament psalm as found in the book of Psalms. But with respect to the identifying characteristics of the Lament Psalms, besides those three recurring components, there is one other secondary literary component, that of the affirmation to praise. An affirmation to praise occurs in about 40% of the Lament Psalms. And the affirmation of praise is often a very brief statement that is not elaborated on, and structurally it usually occurs toward the end of the Psalms. The question arises as to whether the praise being spoken of in the affirmation to praise, whether that praise is being given in the midst of the distress, or is it referring to a future voicing of praise? Well, if the praise is being given in the midst of the suffering, it is not praising God because of the suffering, nor is it praising God in spite of the suffering, nor is it praising God ignoring the suffering. Rather, it is praising God in anticipation of the suffering ending through God's intervention. In other words, the praise anticipates what God will do. It is future focused. It is not elicited by nor directed toward the disorientation that is currently happening. But given the circumstances of disorientation, of distress and anguish, and given the context of the mood expressed by the Lament Psalm itself, the affirmation of praise in many cases is probably not to be understood as, I am currently praising God while in the midst of the distress, but rather it is an affirmation that anticipates being able to praise once again in the future after God has intervened. That when God delivers, the psalmist will be able to once again praise with authenticity. So the psalmist makes a commitment that they will voice praise to God when God has answered. And in that sense, the affirmation to praise actually becomes a vow to praise. In the combined Psalms of 42 and 43, the psalmist alternates speaking about the present situation, his past experience, and the future expectation. So in verse 3, the psalmist speaks of the present circumstances. My tears have been my food day and night. But then in verse 4, the psalmist remembers the past when He used to pray in corporate worship celebrations. And those things I remember as I currently pour out my soul. How I used to go to the house of God with shouts of joy and praise among the festive throngs. But first, verse 5a returns back to the present, that in the present he's downcast. Why, my soul, are you so downcast? Why so disturbed within me? And then in verse 5b comes the affirmation to praise. Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise him, my Savior and in God, my Savior and God. And the affirmation here clearly seems to be an anticipation that praise will come once again in the future. As in verse 6 and following, the psalmist again stresses the present reality. Right now, the psalmist is down in the dumps and weeping. My soul is downcast. Why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony. In other words, in the present, the psalmist is not praising, but he does anticipate being able to do so in the future. That once again, he will be able to praise the Lord. And that becomes clear that this is a future anticipation as this combined psalm continues in Psalm 43. Again, in verse 2, he talks about the present. You are God, my stronghold. Why have you rejected me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? But then in verses 3 and 4, the psalmist focuses again on the future, when he can go to the temple and when he will be able to join in the festive celebration of praise once again. Send me your light and your faithful care. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. And then I will go to the altar of God, to God my joy and my delight. I will praise you with the lyre, O God, my God. So clearly in Psalms 42 and 43, praise was a past occurrence. It is something that is also anticipated for the future. But in Psalms 42 and 43, it is not a present reality. And I think we have to view most of the affirmations of praise in the Lament Psalms as referencing a future event. In other words, again, the psalmist is not saying, I am praising you now in the midst of the storm. Rather, the psalmist is saying, God, when you deliver, when you rescue, when you answer my prayer, then I will with full integrity praise you once again. And so the psalmist with confidence anticipates that the time of praise will come again. The psalmists commit themselves to praising when that time does come. That when God brings about the transformation from being disoriented to being reoriented, praise will once again be appropriately voiced. The psalmist will praise when God delivers from the lament of disorientation and the psalmist move into the praise of reorientation. So the lament genre, we identify it and distinguish it from the other genres of the Psalms through the elements of the life context or setting, that in the life rhythm cycle it belongs in the season of disorientation. And we identify lament psalms by the distinctive form, that it is addressed directly to God, and the recurring literary components. There are the three key components, which are in almost every lament psalm, that of complaint, petition, and declarations of confidence and trust. And there is the secondary literary component, that of affirmation to praise. And as we conclude the study of defining the Lament Psalms according to their constituting components, let me just illustrate these in closing through Psalm 13, where all of the components are clearly evident. That verses 1 and 2 begin with the three kinds of complaint addressed to God. How long, O Yahweh, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? And then the I complaint, how long must I bear pain within myself and have sorrow in my heart every day? And then the they complaint, how long will my enemies be exalted over me? And the complaint then moves into the petition. Because it seems as if God has hidden his face, expressed in verse 1. The psalmist then petitions, look, answer me, O Yahweh my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, or my enemies will say, I have overcome him, or my enemies will rejoice because I am shaken. In other words, it seems like God has hidden his face, so he first appeals for God to look upon him, to take notice, to turn his face toward him. And as he mentioned, the enemies are exalting over him in verse 3. He says, the motivation for the petition becomes, unless you do something, the enemies are going to continue to exalt over me. But then in verse 5a, he moves to the statement of trust. And I, in your steadfast love, have trusted. Followed in the end of the psalm in 5b and 6 with the affirmation of anticipated praise. And simply to note that at the end of verse 6 there, the Hebrew particle can be translated either as because, or the causal because, or the temporal when. The affirmation of praise. My heart will rejoice in your deliverance. I will sing to Yahweh because he has dealt bountifully with me, or I will sing to Yahweh when he has dealt bountifully with me. And thus the constituting components of the Lament Psalms as prayers directed address directly to God.